Hey y'all, thank you for tuning in to Collapse Talk. This episode, I will be highlighting a era in U.S. history spanning between the end of the Civil War even up until the Civil Rights Act. So almost 100 years of history, and specifically speaking on this era of racial terror that had occurred in the wake of the closure of the Civil War. And so this is a pretty significant episode for American history, and it certainly helps us to understand the underlying racial politics and other cultural issues in our own time. And so there's much to uncover, much that has been hidden and also just reappropriated, especially with lost cause and neo-Confederate revisionism. And so there's much to dive into this episode. And before I do that, I would certainly encourage you to check out my podcast, Collapse Talk, and also my Patreon for further content. And so we'll just dive right in. There is certainly much to talk about, and we will open up with the end of the Civil War, this bloody Civil War with over 600,000 dead, and the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. It was certainly a monumentous moment, a moment that was just unstable. The country was ripped apart and mended back together, and the assassination of Abraham Lincoln would lead to the rise of his Democratic vice president, Andrew Johnson. And so Andrew Johnson was a Southerner, and although he was a Unionist, he was certainly sympathetic towards the ex-Confederates who had just seceded. And so he wasn't particularly big on Reconstruction and also the enfranchisement of these freedmen. And so he was certainly an obstacle in those efforts, especially for the Freedmen Bureau and other efforts to rein in this occupied South. The South at this time was divided between 5 military districts, and so it was a practical military occupation, although it still didn't go the whole way. Many of the plantation lords of the Confederacy were compensated. They were allowed to go back to their lands, and a lot of the times they still were not necessarily owning the slaves, but they still very much employed them. So it was mainly like a apprenticeship sort of deal. The black codes and other laws that just basically retained their workforce. So it was just slavery, but just with a different brand, a different covering.
Mr. Moses, what are you?
Free man, Captain.
Why's that?
Because you cannot own a child of God.
No, you cannot, can you? You can own a horse, you can own a mule, or a cow, or an ox, but you cannot own a child of God.
Still, for their slave masters, there were much gains made in the South. There were plenty of black congressmen, senators elected during this time under the radical Republicans. And so this was certainly a big change for the political landscape. It was certainly a shock for many of the white supremacist attitudes at the time. Of course, many of the whites in these areas in the South were poor and non-slave owning, but they couldn't handle with the idea of blacks being their equal. And so this led to much racial violence. There was the Knights of Camellia, the White League, the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, many terrorist organizations that were formed during this time. And so after Andrew Johnson was impeached because he was lagging behind in the Reconstruction efforts, there was Ulysses S. Grant, and he was elected president, and he certainly did what he could to enforce the peace against many of the racial terrorism that was occurring. In 1866, there was the Memphis riot, a massacre against black people, and also in New Orleans during this time, there was racial violence. And again, many of these perpetuators were white ex-Confederates who were attempting to bring violence against the newly freed black Americans, who were still having to have their rights enfranchised, their rights ratified under the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. So still during this time, there's much change happening. Black elected officials, Republicans. We also have the carpetbaggers. We also have the Redeemer Democrats, who were these Southern Confederates attempting to redeem the South. And all of these efforts were made to effectively end the Reconstruction and have these federal troops out of the South as soon as possible. And so under Ulysses S. Grant, there were gains met until the election of 1876. And during the election of 1876, there was much contention over the results. There were fears of renewed political violence. And so a compromise was made. And so Rutherford B. Hayes still very much had control by the time that they had made their deal. It was already certified with the Electoral Commission, but the Compromise of 1876 was still made just to cement the political dealings and also to just allow for the Democrats to not create much tension and much resistance to this new administration. So this compromise that was happening after the election, 1877, effectively ended the Reconstruction era. It allowed for the Democrats, the Southern ex-Confederate Democrats, to gain much of their political power, the removal of federal troops and federal occupation, and really the beginning of the Jim Crow era. And this era of disenfranchisement for Black Americans would see their rights reversed, their voting rights, their job opportunities, property rights, segregation, everything that we're used to about the Deep South segregation. This is when it starts. 1877 moving forward. And also during this era, we see these legislations and these black codes. We see these Jim Crow laws being made to divide the public and also to terrorize Black Americans. And so this time saw a lot of racial animosity, a lot of racial terror. It's often referred to as the nadir of American race relations. And so this is really the dark period of racial violence, of lynchings, race massacres, up until the 20s, really the majority of the serious violence. But yeah, lynching still occurred up until the 50s and 60s. So this was still very much a violent area for Black Americans.
Henry Smith was tortured for over an hour and then burned alive before 10,000 people in Paris, Texas. They sold his body parts as souvenirs. Today, there is no marker acknowledging what happened here, only an abandoned lot where this public spectacle lynching took place. In Birmingham, Alabama, schoolteacher Elizabeth Lawrence was lynched by a white mob. She was not accused of any crime, but had merely scolded white children who were throwing rocks at her. When her son sought justice for his mother's lynching, the same mob pursued him, forcing him to flee to Boston.
And so there are plenty of examples of race massacres occurring during this time. And so there is the Red Summer in 1919 that saw racial unrest and riots in places like Chicago, Washington, D.C. There's also the Elaine Massacre that saw up to 200 Black people killed in Arkansas over a suspected insurrection. There was also the Greenwood District Massacre, also known as the Tulsa Race Riot. That is the largest episode of racial violence. There's also the Rosewood Massacre and plenty of other examples of lynchings. And there are websites now actually that document this. They have compiled all the information, all the recorded lynchings that have occurred, and places like Texas and places like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. So this is certainly a period of racial violence, of racial terror that's occurring, part of the white supremacist attitudes, the white supremacist politics, the KKK and other terrorist organizations during this time, and a lot of racial attitudes. Certainly you can see caricatures and cartoons. Yeah, very, very racist to begin with, very just overall. And, we would have also presidents such as Woodrow Wilson, who was a Southern Democrat. He was an avid appreciator of the notorious film A Birth of a Nation, screening it in the White House. And this is a period where the KKK, or is often known as the second wave or the second iteration of the KKK, this period saw up to, some say, 6 million members. So this is certainly a major movement. They had parades in Washington, D.C. There were plenty of notorious historical figures, political figures with affiliations. So this is certainly a time where there was racial tensions and animosity that led to the deaths of up to 4,000 in some estimates, and those are just recorded estimates of 4,000 Black Americans. And this racial terror is what led to much of the repopulating of the North, of places like Chicago, New York, places in the West such as Los Angeles, San Francisco, mainly fleeing the racial terror that they're experiencing in the South and looking for work, job opportunities. This is just before World War I, World War II, where manufacturing and industries were booming, offering plenty of opportunities for people of color to work. And so this is just another episode of the racial migrations that have occurred within the United States, also just racial terror that has occurred, not even in the South, because there was plenty of racial animosity and racial harassment of people of color in the North and in the West. So anywhere that Black people had moved into, they were going to experience discrimination. But, you take your chances with, some street cop in LA giving you trouble versus having a mob visit you because there was a rumor that you were involved with an inappropriate interaction. I mean, some infamous events such as the Emmett Till murder just occurring over a simple suspected lack of decorum on Emmett Till's part. And this was happening in the 50s. So this is still very much something that's within living memory. In fact, looking at places that I've lived in, looking at the Texas database, the most recent that I have found in my own hometown of Katy, Texas, was in November 10th, 1926. There was a triple homicide, effectively on a homestead. Yeah, so this is within living memory. This is 1926, the same year that the former Queen Elizabeth was born. So, yeah, this is within living memory. This is stuff that had happened that people today are still alive. There are still survivors of the Tulsa race riot, and they're suing the state of Oklahoma for reparations. Plenty of other examples of racial violence and racial terror that has occurred. So this era, from Reconstruction all the way up until the 1920s, the 50s even, with the civil rights, this era saw racial terror normalized. It saw the rise of white supremacy in Southern politics and plenty of mainstream politicians. Yeah, certainly an era that had led to the migration of Black Americans throughout the United States, looking for work opportunities and changing the demographics of many of these areas. And of course, that would also lead to greater demographic changes such as white flight, white people fleeing these areas within the cities to the suburbs and to the outskirts. And so that is another issue that should be examined, but that will be examined later on. So yeah, that is pretty much just a quick rundown of the Confederacy or the neo-Confederate ideals, and also of just the racial animosity that Black people have faced within the United States. I mean, these racial lynchings that occurred were certainly a social event that was just normalized. There were instances of spectators stealing body parts for souvenirs. So they would burn a suspected criminal, usually these Black suspects that were accused of a murder or some sort of sexual assault. And so they would parade them through town and execute them in the public square or some public lot. And it would be a fanfare event. It would be a spectator event picnics and music, festival music, pictures taken, as I said, postcards from the event. So yeah, this was certainly something that was a bit of a ritual for Southern whites, and yeah, it's still something that's very fresh on people's minds today. So yeah, that's what America has been about for 100 years or so. So yeah, so that is the racial terror that has been occurring within the United States. And so, that is a quick rundown. And so if you want to support my work further, certainly look at my Patreon for more podcasts and more video essays that will be coming out in time, and certainly looking to issues such as racial terror, racial issues within the United States, and other working class problems and history issues. So thank you again for tuning in. And again, thank you for my supporters on Patreon for your endorsement. And we'll see you on the next one.